The mud tasted like death. That's what Private James Sullivan would tell anyone who asked, though no one ever did. It was December 1944, and the frozen earth of the Ardennes Forest had swallowed so many men that the ground itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of their stories. But on this night, this impossibly cold night when frost turned our breath into ghosts, something happened that I still cannot fully explain. Even now, 70 years later, as I sit in my quiet apartment in Boston, waiting for my own final song to begin. I was 23 years old, though I felt ancient. We all did. The war had aged us in ways that time alone could never accomplish. My hands, once steady enough to thread my mother's needles back in cork, now trembled constantly. But that night, those same hands would hold something more precious than any weapon I'd carried across Europe. They would hold hope, fragile as glass, wrapped in melody. The German position was less than 200 yards away, close enough that we could hear them coughing, cursing, crying for their mothers in the darkness. Close enough that we knew they were just like us, terrified boys pretending to be men, counting the hours until dawn brought either liberation or oblivion. Our trench was a grave we lived in, 6 feet deep and filling slowly with snow that mixed with the blood of the man beside me, whose name I never learned, because he'd been transferred to our unit only that morning and was dead by noon. Lieutenant Coleman had ordered absolute silence after sunset. Not a whisper, he'd said, his young face trying to wear authority like an oversized coat. The Germans have patrols out. They're listening. So we sat in that frozen silence, each of us alone with our thoughts, our fears, our desperate prayers to gods we were no longer sure were listening. The cold was so intense that it felt like being burned alive in reverse. My toes had lost all feeling 3 days ago. I wondered if I'd ever walk normally again, if there would even be a again after tonight. That's when I heard it, faint at first. So faint I thought I'd imagined it. A sound carried on the wind that cut through the Ardennes like a knife through butter. Singing. The Germans were singing. Stille Nacht, they called it. We knew it as Silent Night. The melody drifted across no man's land like smoke, weaving between the barbed wire and the frozen corpses we couldn't retrieve, finding its way into our trench where it wrapped around us like a blanket we didn't know we desperately needed. Beside me, Corporal Thomas Red McCarthy began to cry. Not the silent tears we'd all learned to shed, those invisible acknowledgments of grief that we hid from each other, but great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Red was from Montana, a ranch hand who could ride any horse and shoot the eye out of a hawk at 100 yards. He'd killed 17 men that we knew of, maybe more. He'd watched his best friend burn to death in a tank outside Bastogne. He'd stopped sleeping because his dreams were full of screaming. But the song, the simple, pure sound of enemy voices singing about peace on earth, broke something in him that bullets couldn't touch. My mama used to sing that, he whispered, his voice raw. Every Christmas Eve. She'd make us all hold hands around the tree, and we'd sing it together. My baby sister couldn't carry a tune worth a damn, but Mama said that didn't matter. She said God loves an honest voice more than a pretty one. I put my hand on Red's shoulder, feeling him shake, feeling the last remnants of his humanity rattling around inside a shell that had been hollowed out by horror. Around us, others were having similar moments of devastating clarity. Private First Class Eddie Morrison from Brooklyn was mumbling the Lord's Prayer. Sergeant William Hayes, who everyone called Old Man, even though he was only 32, had his eyes closed and his lips moving silently. Whether in prayer or curse, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. The German song ended, and for a moment, the silence that followed was even more profound than what had come before. It was a silence full of possibility, pregnant with something none of us could name, but all of us felt. It was Lieutenant Coleman who broke it, and in doing so, changed everything that followed. "Sullivan," he said quietly, "you can sing, can't you? I heard you once back at camp." I stared at him, wondering if the cold had finally frozen his brain. "Sir, you gave orders. I know what I ordered, Private. I'm giving you a new order. Sing something. Sing it loud enough that they can hear us. Sir, that's suicide. They'll know exactly where we are. They could drop mortars on this position and..." "That's a direct order, Private Sullivan." So I stood up. It was the stupidest thing I'd ever done, and I'd done plenty of stupid things in this war. I stood up in that trench, my head and shoulders visible above the parapet, a perfect target silhouetted against the snow. My legs shook, partly from fear, partly from the cold that had settled into my bones like a second skeleton. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst through my ribcage and flee on its own. And I sang, "O holy night, the stars are brightly shining." My voice cracked on the first word. It was rough, unpracticed, abraded by months of shouting orders and screaming warnings and crying names of dead friends into the void. But it was honest. God loves an honest voice more than a pretty one, Red's mama had said. I prayed she was right. It is the night of our dear Savior's birth. The words poured out of me, carrying with them everything I couldn't say any other way. My grief for my brother Patrick, who died at Normandy. My longing for my father's pub in Cork where the air smelled like peat smoke and the laughter was real. My terror that I would die in this frozen hell without ever tasting my mother's bread again or holding a woman who loved me or seeing the green hills of home one more time. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. Something extraordinary happened then. One by one, the men in our trench stood up. First Red, tears still streaming down his face, his voice rough but strong. Then Morrison, then Hayes, then Coleman himself. Within moments, 37 American soldiers were standing exposed in a trench in the Ardennes Forest, singing a Christmas carol to their enemies, offering their lives to melody. A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices. For yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. And then, God help me, I'll never forget this. The Germans stood up too, across no man's land, through the darkness and the snow and the space where so much blood had been spilled. They rose from their positions and joined us. Not in English, not in German, but in Latin, the ancient language of the church that belonged to all of us and none of us, the tongue of prayers and rituals that transcended the madness of war. Natus est Emmanuel, natus est Emmanuel, 200 voices, maybe more, singing together in the darkness. American and German, Protestant and Catholic, farm boys and factory workers, students and soldiers, men who had been trying to kill each other for months, united in song. The sound rolled across the frozen landscape like thunder, like prophecy, like the voice of God himself demanding that we remember our humanity. When the song ended, no one moved. We stood there, American and German, staring at each other across the divide that war had carved into the earth. The silence was different now, not empty, but full, weighted with the terrible knowledge of what we'd just done. We'd seen each other, not as targets, not as abstractions, not as the enemy, but as men. Young men, frightened men, cold and tired and desperately homesick men who wanted nothing more than to survive this nightmare and return to the people who loved them. Lieutenant Coleman was the first to break the spell. "Get down!" he hissed. "All of you, get down now." But his voice lacked conviction. He'd stood up too. He'd sung too. He'd felt what we'd all felt. That moment of transcendence when the war stopped being about territory and tactics and became about the simple, impossible wish for peace. We sank back into our trench, but everything had changed. Private Morrison was laughing, actually laughing, a sound so foreign in that place that it seemed obscene. "Did that really just happen?" he kept saying. "Did we really just sing with the Krauts? Did that really just happen?" "Shut up, Morrison," Sergeant Hayes said, but there was no anger in his voice. He sounded dazed, like a man waking from a dream he wasn't sure he wanted to leave. Red McCarthy sat down heavily beside me, his back against the frozen wall of the trench. "Jimmy," he said. He was the only one who called me Jimmy instead of Sullivan. "Jimmy," my hands stopped shaking. "Look." He held them out in the darkness. They were steady. For the first time in months, they were steady. How is that possible? I didn't have an answer. Nothing about this night made sense. We were in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. More than 19,000 American soldiers would die in this forest before it was over. But on this night, in this one small corner of hell, something different had happened. Something impossible. "Contact!" someone shouted from down the line. "Someone's coming across!" We grabbed our rifles, our fingers fumbling for triggers, our hearts racing. This was it then. It had been a trick. The Germans had used our moment of weakness to launch an attack. We'd been fools to stand up, fools to sing, fools to believe even for a moment that music could stop bullets. But it wasn't an attack. A single German soldier was walking across no man's land, his hands raised. Something white tied to the end of his rifle. A flag of truce. He was young, younger than me, maybe 19 or 20, with a thin face and hollow eyes that had seen too much. He stopped halfway between the trenches and called out in surprisingly good English, "Please, I wish to speak with your officer. I mean no harm. My name is Hans Becker. I am from Munich. I was a music student before the war." Lieutenant Coleman looked at me, then at Hayes, then back at the German soldier standing alone in the snow. "Cover me," he said, and climbed out of the trench. The two officers met in no man's land, between the wire, in the space where men usually only went to die. We watched them talk, unable to hear the words, seeing only their breath forming clouds in the freezing air, seeing their gestures, tentative at first, then more animated. When Coleman returned, his face was white. Not from cold, but from shock. "They want a ceasefire," he said, "just for tonight. Christmas Eve, they want to bury their dead. They want to—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "They want to exchange gifts. They have cigarettes and chocolate. They're asking if we have coffee and soap." "It's a trap," someone said. "Maybe," Coleman replied. "Probably. But I'm going to take it anyway. Anyone who wants to stay in this trench, you're welcome to. But I'm going out there, because if there's even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that we can stop killing each other for one night, I'm taking it." He climbed out. I followed. So did Red. So did Morrison and Hayes, and eventually all 37 of us. We walked into no man's land, that cursed space where the grass grew thick and green in summer from all the blood that fertilized it, where unexploded shells waited like sleeping dragons, where the ghosts of the dead watched us with empty eyes. We walked toward our enemies and they walked toward us, and when we met in the middle, we shook hands. Hans Becker was crying. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. For all of this. For everything." His English was accented but clear, learned from a British governess before the war, when the world made sense and the future held promise instead of terror. I wanted to be a conductor. I was studying at the conservatory. Brahms, Wagner, Beethoven. I was going to lead great orchestras. And now I lead men to their deaths. "I know," I told him, because I did know. We all knew. We'd all had dreams once, before the war took them from us and replaced them with nightmares. I wanted to open a restaurant in Dublin. My specialty was going to be seafood chowder, my mother's recipe. "That sounds wonderful," Hans said, and smiled. A genuine smile that transformed his haggard face into something young and hopeful again, just for a moment. "Perhaps after the war, I will visit your restaurant, and you will serve me this chowder, and I will tell you it's the best meal I've ever had." "Perhaps," I said, though we both knew the odds of either of us surviving long enough to see that day were vanishingly small. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month. Most of the men standing in no man's land that night would be dead before New Year's Day. But for now, we were alive. We were human. We traded cigarettes for chocolate, coffee for soap. We showed each other photographs of sweethearts and mothers and children we'd never met. Private Morrison produced a harmonica from his pack and played Amazing Grace, and the Germans hummed along. Someone built a small fire, dangerous, suicidal really. But no one cared anymore, and we huddled around it, sharing warmth like it was the most precious commodity in the world. Red McCarthy sat next to a German sergeant named Klaus who had a farm in Bavaria. They couldn't understand each other's words, but they communicated through gestures and smiles and the universal language of men who were bone-tired and soul-sick and grateful beyond measure for this moment of respite. Klaus showed Red a picture of his 3 daughters. Red showed Klaus a picture of his mother and his baby sister who couldn't carry a tune. They both cried. "Why are we doing this?" Klaus asked through Hans, who translated. "Why are we killing each other?" "My daughters need a father. Your sister needs a brother." Why? No one had an answer. Or maybe we all had the same answer, and it was too terrible to speak aloud. Because old men in distant capitals had decided it should be so, and we were too young or too scared or too conditioned to disobey. Because war, once started, develops its own momentum, its own logic, its own hunger that can never be satisfied. Because stopping would mean admitting that all the deaths up to this point had been meaningless, and that was a truth too heavy to bear. Lieutenant Coleman stood up. "It's almost midnight," he said. "Christmas Day. I propose we do something radical. I propose we have a moment of silence. 1 minute. For all the men who aren't here. American, German, British, Russian, Japanese, doesn't matter. For everyone who died in this war. For everyone who will die tomorrow. 1 minute to remember them." We stood, Americans and Germans together, and bowed our heads. The forest was completely silent except for the wind in the trees and the crackling of our small fire. I thought about Patrick, my brother, who'd stepped on a mine 3 hours after landing at Omaha Beach. I thought about Charlie Henderson from my training company, who'd died screaming in my arms outside Caen. I thought about all the Germans I'd killed, and there were many, too many, whose faces I still saw every night when I closed my eyes. Young faces, frightened faces, faces that looked like Hans Becker's face, like Klaus's face, like mirrors showing me myself. When the minute ended, Hans Becker began to sing again. This time it wasn't a Christmas carol. It was something older, something that predated the war, predated even the hatreds that had caused it. It was a simple folk song about home, about returning to the place where you were loved. His voice was beautiful, trained, refined, everything mine wasn't. It soared over the frozen landscape like a bird, like hope itself taking wing. One by one, we joined him. We didn't know the German words, so we hummed, creating a harmony that shouldn't have been possible, that defied everything we'd been taught about the enemy. The music rose and fell, carrying our longings into the night sky where perhaps God was listening, was seeing this moment of grace in the midst of chaos, was remembering that he had made us in his image, and that image included the capacity for mercy. The first light of Christmas morning crept over the Ardennes like a thief, stealing away the magic of the night that had sheltered us. I watched it come with a sense of dread so profound it made my chest physically ache, because dawn meant the ceasefire would end. Dawn meant we would return to our trenches. Dawn meant that Hans Becker and Klaus and all the other Germans whose names I'd learned, whose stories I'd heard, whose humanity I'd witnessed, they would become the enemy again. We were still gathered around the dying embers of our fire, American and German soldiers sprawled in exhausted heaps like children after a long day of play. Private Morrison had fallen asleep on Klaus's shoulder. Red McCarthy was teaching a young German private named Peter how to play poker using stones as chips. Lieutenant Coleman sat next to Hans Becker, and they were speaking quietly in French, which they both knew, about philosophy and music and all the things that mattered before the war made everything else irrelevant. "We should go back," someone said. I don't remember who. Maybe it was Sergeant Hayes. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the voice of reality itself, demanding we acknowledge that the spell was breaking, that Cinderella's ball was ending, that we had to return to the nightmare we called duty. Hans Becker stood up slowly, like an old man, though he couldn't have been more than 20. "Yes," he said, "we must return, but first." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Lieutenant Coleman. "My mother gave this to me before I left Munich. She said it would protect me, but I think perhaps I am already lost, so I would like you to have it. When the war is over, if you survive, perhaps you could find my family. Tell them I wasn't a monster. Tell them I remembered how to be human, at least for one night." Coleman unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a small wooden carving of a bird. Intricate, beautiful, clearly made by a master craftsman. "I can't accept this," he said. "This is too precious." "Please," Hans insisted. "I need to know it will survive, even if I don't. I need to know that something beautiful will make it through this war intact." Coleman took the carving, his hands shaking. "I'll find them," he promised. "When this is over, I'll find your family and I'll tell them. I swear it." They shook hands, and then they embraced. Quickly, awkwardly, but genuinely. When they separated, both men had tears in their eyes. We said our goodbyes, though goodbye was too simple a word for what we were doing. We were severing connections that shouldn't have been formed, mourning friendships that would probably end in death within hours or days, saying farewell to the versions of ourselves that had been able to see enemies as human beings. Red McCarthy gripped Klaus's hand for a long moment, neither speaking, both understanding that words would only make this harder. Morrison woke up and realized where he'd been sleeping, and looked mortified, until the German soldier he'd been leaning on smiled, and patted his shoulder and said something, in German that sounded kind. We walked back across no man's land slowly, reluctantly, like men walking to their own executions, because in a sense we were the people we'd been for those few hours, the men who could sing with our enemies, share our food, laugh at the same jokes. Those people had to die so that the soldiers could return. The machine of war demanded it. Our officers, who hadn't been here, who hadn't felt what we felt, would demand it. The logic of combat, which said that every German alive was a threat to our survival, demanded it. When we reached our trench, we climbed down into it silently. The mud, which had seemed merely uncomfortable before, now felt like a grave closing over us. The darkness felt more complete. The cold felt more absolute. We'd been given a glimpse of warmth and humanity, and now returning to this felt like a second damnation. "All right, listen up," Lieutenant Coleman said, his voice carefully neutral, professionally detached. The voice of an officer addressing his men, not the voice of the man who had just embraced an enemy and promised to find his mother. "What happened tonight? What we did. It can never happen again. Command would have us shot if they knew. Hell, they'd probably be right to do it. We violated every protocol, endangered our position, potentially compromised our mission. So here's how this is going to work. It didn't happen. We sat in this trench all night, cold and miserable and silent, just like we were ordered to. Anyone who says different will have me to answer to. Understood? We mumbled our agreement, but it felt hollow. How could we pretend that the most significant night of our lives hadn't happened? How could we unsee what we'd seen? Unknow what we'd learned about the men we were supposed to kill without question or hesitation? Sir, Red McCarthy said quietly, how are we supposed to… tomorrow, when they order us to advance and we're shooting at them again? How do we do that now? Coleman looked at him, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped. I saw raw anguish in his face, the face of a man who had been given an impossible burden and knew he would carry it for the rest of his life. I don't know, Corporal. I honestly don't know. We do it because we have to. Because if we don't, more of us die. Because war doesn't care about friendships formed in the dark, or songs sung in Latin, or wooden birds carved by someone's mother. War only cares about who wins and who loses, who lives and who dies. The sun continued to rise, indifferent to our moral crisis. By full light, the German trench was just a line of disturbed earth again, a target, a position to be taken or defended against. The men inside it were invisible, abstract, once more reduced to the enemy in our minds, because that was the only way we could function. But I knew they were there. I knew Hans Becker was probably sitting in his trench just like I was sitting in mine, struggling with the same questions, feeling the same grief at what we'd found and lost in the space of a few hours. I knew Klaus was looking at the pictures of his daughters and wondering if he'd ever see them again. I knew Peter was probably still thinking about the poker game Red had taught him, remembering how to laugh. At 0800 hours, the order came down. Artillery barrage in 30 minutes, followed by an advance on the German position. Objective: take the ridge, eliminate all enemy combatants, secure the high ground. Standard stuff. Just another day in the war. Just another chance to die or to kill, or more likely both. Check your weapons, Sergeant Hayes said mechanically. Make sure your ammunition is dry. When we go over the top, stay low and move fast. Watch for machine gun nests. Stay together. Watch each other's backs. I checked my rifle. It was clean, functional, ready to deal death. My hands were shaking again. Red's temporary steadiness from the night before had abandoned him too, I noticed. We looked at each other across the trench, and I saw my own horror reflected in his eyes. How could we do this? How could we kill men we'd sung with, laughed with, shared chocolate with? But I knew the answer. We would do it because soldiers have been doing it since the beginning of war. We would do it because the alternative was dying ourselves, and the survival instinct is stronger than morality, stronger than conscience, stronger even than the memory of a Christmas Eve miracle. We would do it because that's what war does to people. It takes the best in them and twists it into something that can pull a trigger without hesitation, that can throw a grenade into a trench without wondering whose son or father or brother it will kill. The artillery started exactly on time. The shells screamed over our heads and exploded in the German positions with earth-shaking force. I tried not to imagine Hans Becker huddled in his trench, hands over his ears, praying in German the same prayers I'd prayed when I was on the receiving end of a barrage. I tried not to think about Klaus and his 3 daughters who needed their father. I tried not to be human, because humanity was a liability in this moment. Fix bayonets, Coleman ordered. We did. On my signal, we go over. Remember your training. Remember your duty. Remember that these men would kill you without hesitation if the positions were reversed. But would they? After last night, could any of us be certain of that? The whistle blew. We climbed out of the trench and began to run across no man's land, screaming to give ourselves courage, firing our weapons at shadows and smoke and the vague shapes of men trying to kill us before we killed them. The world became noise and chaos and terror, all the things war is best at creating. I saw Red go down, clutching his leg, saw Morrison drag him back toward our lines. I saw Sergeant Hayes firing his Thompson in short, controlled bursts, saw him fall too, saw him not get up. And then I saw Hans Becker. He was in the German trench, his rifle raised, his face a mask of fear and determination. Our eyes met across 30 feet of devastated earth. For one eternal moment, time stopped. I saw recognition in his face. He remembered me, remembered our conversation, remembered that I was going to open a restaurant in Dublin and serve my mother's chowder. I saw him hesitate, his finger on the trigger, his whole body frozen in indecision. That hesitation saved my life, and ended his. Private Morrison, recovered from helping Red, shot Hans Becker 3 times in the chest. I watched him fall, watched the light go out in his eyes, watched him become just another casualty, another number, another victory in the endless arithmetic of war. I carried Hans Becker's body back across no man's land. I don't remember deciding to do it. I don't remember thinking it was a good idea or weighing the risks. I just knew I couldn't leave him there in the mud, face down in the same trench where he'd stood and sung Stille Nacht less than 12 hours ago. Morrison tried to stop me. "Sullivan, what the hell are you doing?" "He's dead! Leave him!" But I shook him off and went back. Hans was heavier than I expected. Death had made him solid, immovable, as if the earth itself wanted to claim him immediately. His blood soaked through my uniform as I dragged him across no man's land, mixing with the snow and mud, creating patterns that looked like abstract art, like something that should have meaning, but didn't. German machine guns were still firing. American artillery was still falling, but somehow, impossibly, nothing hit me. Maybe God was watching after all, or maybe he'd looked away in shame and couldn't bear to see what we'd become. I laid Hans's body in our trench as gently as I could, which wasn't very gentle because gentleness and war are mutually exclusive concepts. Lieutenant Coleman stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Sullivan, what have you done? You can't bring an enemy combatant into our position." He wasn't a combatant, sir," I said, my voice flat, dead, completely devoid of emotion because I'd used up all my emotions and had nothing left. He was a music student from Munich who wanted to be a conductor. He had a mother who carved wooden birds. He was 20 years old. His name was Hans Becker, and we murdered him. "We didn't murder him," Coleman said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is war. People die in war. That's what—" "Don't," I interrupted. "Please don't tell me that's what happens. Don't insult both of us by pretending this is normal or acceptable or anything other than what it is. An abomination. We sang with him. We broke bread with him. We made promises to him. And then we killed him. If there's a hell, and after today I'm certain there is, we've earned our places in it." Coleman's face crumpled. He looked suddenly ancient, worn down by the weight of command and the burden of moral compromise that leadership requires. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wooden bird Hans had given him. It was splattered with mud and blood now, but still beautiful, still perfect in its craftsmanship. "I made him a promise," Coleman said quietly. "I told him I'd find his family, tell them he remained human." He laughed bitterly. "How do I do that now? How do I look his mother in the eye and tell her I let her son die? That I ordered the attack that killed him? You keep your promise anyway," I said, "because it's the only decent thing we have left." The battle continued for 3 more days. We took the ridge, lost it, took it again. The Germans counterattacked, we held, they retreated. Back and forth, the same meaningless dance we'd been doing for months. Except now every German face I saw made me think of Hans Becker's face. Made me wonder if this was Klaus, if this was Peter, if this was someone else I'd met during those stolen hours of Christmas Eve when we'd all remembered we were human. Red McCarthy's leg was badly wounded. Shrapnel had torn through his calf muscle and shattered his fibula. Morrison had stayed with him, dragging him to safety while bullets kicked up snow and mud all around them. "Couldn't leave him," Morrison explained later, as if it needed explaining. He taught me what his mama said, about honest voices being better than pretty ones. Couldn't let him die out there. Red was evacuated 2 days after Christmas. Before they took him away, he grabbed my hand with desperate strength. "Jimmy," he said, his eyes wild with morphine and pain and something deeper. "Jimmy, tell me it was real. Tell me that night actually happened. Tell me we really sang with them. Because if it wasn't real, if I imagined it, then there's nothing good left in the world at all." "It was real," I promised him. "I swear to you, Red, it was real." "Good," he said, relaxing slightly. "Good. Because I'm going to hold on to that memory for the rest of my life. It's going to be what saves me, I think. When the nightmares come, and they will come, they always come, I'm going to remember that night. And I'm going to remember that we were better than this, even if just for a few hours." They carried him away on a stretcher, and I never saw him again. Later, much later, years after the war, I tried to find him. I wrote letters to the Veterans Administration, to his family's ranch in Montana, to every Thomas McCarthy I could locate. But either he never received my letters, or he chose not to respond. Maybe the memory of that night was too painful. Maybe he wanted to forget. Or maybe he died like so many of us did in different ways, even those of us who survived. Sergeant Hayes was dead. So was Private Morrison, killed 3 days after he saved Red's life when a German sniper shot him through the throat while he was distributing rations. So were 11 others from our company, including 2 who'd been at the Christmas Eve gathering. Their names were added to the endless list of casualties, their bodies sent home in flag-draped coffins, or not sent home, if there wasn't enough left to send. Their families notified by telegram in language that made their deaths sound noble and purposeful instead of random and wasteful. Klaus, we learned later, had also died. Not in combat, but from exposure. He'd been wounded in the battle and had crawled into a shell crater. where he froze to death over the course of Christmas night while we were warm in our trenches, arguing about whether what we'd done was brave or stupid, trying to process the cognitive dissonance of having shared songs and chocolate with men we'd killed the next day. His body was found during the spring thaw, still clutching the photograph of his 3 daughters. I don't know if anyone ever told them how he died, if they know that he spent his last Christmas Eve singing with enemies who became friends, who became killers again. The war ended. Eventually, the way wars do, not with resolution, but with exhaustion. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Hitler killed himself in his bunker. The concentration camps were liberated, revealing horrors that made even the worst of the combat seem trivial by comparison. We learned what we'd been fighting against, what we'd been fighting for, and we tried to convince ourselves that it had all been worth it, that the mountain of corpses we'd built had some meaning, some purpose beyond the simple fact that powerful men had decided we should kill each other. Lieutenant Coleman kept his promise. In 1946, after we'd all been discharged and sent home to try to resume lives that no longer fit us, Coleman traveled to Munich. He found Hans Becker's family, or what remained of it. His mother had died during an Allied bombing raid in 1944. His father had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. But his sister was alive, and Coleman gave her the wooden bird and told her what had happened that Christmas Eve in the Ardennes Forest. She wrote me a letter afterward. Coleman had given her my address. Her English was imperfect but beautiful, and she thanked me for trying to save her brother, even though I hadn't, even though I'd failed in every way that mattered. She said Hans had written to her about wanting to be a conductor, about his dreams of leading great orchestras, about how he hoped the war would end soon so he could return to his studies. She said she was glad he'd had that one night, that moment of peace and humanity before he died. She said it comforted her to know he'd been remembered as human, not as the enemy. I still have that letter. It's yellowed now, fragile with age, but I've read it thousands of times over the years. Every time I read it, I cry. Every time, I'm transported back to that frozen forest, to the sound of Hans's voice singing Stille Nacht, to the moment when war paused and we remembered who we were beneath the uniforms. I'm 93 years old now. My hands shake constantly, not from age, but from memories I can't forget. I live alone in a small apartment in Boston, surrounded by photographs of people who are all dead now. My wife Margaret, who I married in 1947 and who tolerated my nightmares for 46 years until cancer took her. My son Michael, who died in Vietnam carrying his own burden of war. My daughter Patricia, who visits me every Sunday and sits patiently while I tell her the same stories over and over because they're the only things that feel real anymore. But I've never told her this story. Not completely. Not the way I'm telling it now, to you, whoever you are, wherever you are, listening to an old man's confession. I went back to the Ardennes once, in 1994, 50 years after that Christmas Eve. The forest had healed itself the way nature always does, covering the scars of war with new growth, hiding the evidence of human madness beneath layers of green and life. The trenches were gone, filled in and reclaimed by the earth. The ridge we'd fought for so desperately was just a hill now. Unremarkable, peaceful, with no indication that men had died there, that blood had soaked into that soil. But I found the place. I knew it by the trees. 3 ancient oaks that had survived the artillery, standing like witnesses to everything that had happened. I stood there for hours, an old man crying in a forest, and I sang. My voice was weaker than it had been at 23, cracked and uncertain, but I sang anyway. O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. And I swear to you, I swear on everything I hold sacred, on my wife's memory and my son's sacrifice and my daughter's love. I heard them join me. Not physically, not in any way I could prove or explain, but I heard Hans Becker's trained voice, and read McCarthy's honest voice, and Klaus's German humming, and Morrison's harmonica and all the others, living and dead, American and German, singing together one more time. A thrill of hope. The weary world rejoices. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe grief and guilt had finally driven me mad. Or maybe, just maybe, some moments are so powerful, so pure, that they transcend time and death, and all the barriers we build between each other. Maybe that Christmas Eve in 1944 created a ripple that continues to echo through eternity, reminding us that beneath the flags and uniforms and propaganda, we're all just scared children looking for reasons to hope. I think about that night constantly now, as I wait for my own end. I think about the choice we were given, to remain enemies or to become human, and how for a few precious hours, we chose humanity. And I think about what happened next, how quickly we reverted to killers, how easily we justified it, How thoroughly we buried that moment of grace beneath mountains of rationalization and duty and necessity. Was it worth it, that one night of peace? Knowing what came after, knowing that Hans would die and Klaus would freeze and Morrison would bleed out and Hayes would fall and Red would lose his leg and his mind and possibly his life. Was it worth it to have those few hours of connection? Yes, God help me, yes. 1,000 times yes. Because that night proved something that war tries desperately to make us forget. That the enemy is a lie. That the divisions we create between us and them are artificial constructs designed to make killing easier, to allow ordinary people to commit extraordinary atrocities without feeling the full weight of what they're doing. That night, we saw through the lie. We touched something true and beautiful and achingly human. And even though we couldn't sustain it, even though the machine of war ground us back down and forced us into our roles, we had that moment. It existed. It was real. I'm telling you this story now because I'm dying. The doctors give me weeks, maybe days. My body is finally giving out after carrying the weight of these memories for 7 decades. And before I go, I need to pass this story on. I need someone else to know what happened in that forest on Christmas Eve 1944. I need someone to remember that we were better than we had to be, even if just for a moment. My daughter found the wooden bird last week while cleaning my apartment. She asked me where it came from, and I told her I'd explain someday. That day is today. Patricia, if you're listening to this recording, and I hope you are, sweetheart, I hope you find this after I'm gone. This bird belonged to a young man named Hans Becker, who dreamed of conducting great orchestras. His mother carved it to protect him, but protection wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. But before he died, he gave this to Lieutenant Coleman, who gave it to me, who is now giving it to you. Keep it. Pass it down to your children. Tell them about the night soldiers sang in the trenches. Tell them about the Christmas Eve when enemies became brothers, even though mourning would make them enemies again. Tell them that peace is possible. Tell them that even in the darkest moments of human history, when everything conspires to make us monsters, we can still choose to be human. It's harder than war, so much harder, because peace requires us to see each other truly, to acknowledge the full humanity of those we're supposed to hate. But it's possible. I know, because I lived it. Lieutenant Coleman died in 2003 at the age of 84. Before he passed, he established a small foundation dedicated to bringing together veterans from opposing sides of conflicts. He called it the Christmas Eve Project. It's still running, still arranging meetings between men who once tried to kill each other, still creating spaces where former enemies can sing together and remember their shared humanity. I've been to 3 of their gatherings over the years. I've shaken hands with Germans who fought at the Bulge, with men who might have been in that trench across from us. We don't ask for names or specifics. We just stand together, old men who survived, and we sing. Every year on Christmas Eve, I go to the Veterans Memorial in Boston. I'm too frail to go alone now. Patricia drives me and helps me walk, but I still go. And at midnight, I stand there in the cold and I sing. Usually I'm alone, but sometimes other veterans join me. Men who served in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Men who carry their own burdens, their own memories of moments when they glimpsed humanity in their enemies and had to kill them anyway. We sing together, these broken old warriors, and for those few minutes, we create a space where war doesn't exist, where young men don't die in mud and snow and sand, where mothers don't lose sons and children don't lose fathers and the world doesn't consume itself in cycles of violence that seem eternal. We sing and we remember and we hope, foolishly, impossibly, that someday, somehow, the songs will be louder than the guns. Red McCarthy's baby sister, the one who couldn't carry a tune, is still alive. I found her 2 years ago, finally, after decades of searching. Her name is Dorothy, and she's 91 years old, living in a nursing home in Helena, Montana. She remembers Red, of course, remembers him coming home from the war changed, haunted, unable to sleep, jumping at loud noises, drinking too much. He killed himself in 1952. He was 31 years old. The demons he'd tried to hold at bay with the memory of our Christmas Eve singing had finally won. But Dorothy also remembers him talking about that night, about the Germans singing across no man's land, about the American private, me, though she didn't know that, who'd stood up first and led them in song. It was the only time I saw him smile after he came back, she told me. When he talked about that night, his face would light up like he was remembering something holy. He said it was proof that God still existed, even in hell. I wish I could have saved Red. I wish I could have saved Hans and Klaus and Morrison and Hayes and all the others. I wish that Christmas Eve miracle had been permanent instead of temporary, that the peace we found could have lasted beyond dawn. But wishing changes nothing. The past is fixed, immutable, a monument to our failures and occasional moments of grace. What I can do, what I'm doing now, with this recording, with this story, is make sure those moments of grace aren't forgotten. Because forgetting is the greatest tragedy. If we forget that night, if we let it disappear into the vast anonymity of history, then it truly becomes meaningless. But if we remember, if we tell the story and pass it on, if we let it inform how we see our enemies and our wars and ourselves, then maybe, just maybe, it can mean something after all. I don't know if there's an afterlife. I don't know if I'll see Margaret again, or Michael, or my parents, or any of the men I served with. But I like to imagine that somewhere, somehow, Hans Becker is conducting his orchestra. Klaus is home with his daughters, who never grew up without a father. Red is sleeping peacefully, free from nightmares. Morrison is playing his harmonica, and we're all together again, singing in the darkness, creating harmony from chaos, proving that the best in humanity is stronger than the worst. If you're listening to this, really listening, not just hearing words but feeling the truth beneath them, I have one request. Don't let the story end here. Don't let this be just another war story filed away and forgotten. Share it, tell it to someone. Especially tell it to people who think war is glorious or necessary or inevitable. Tell them about the night soldiers sang in the trenches. Tell them about the moment when we stopped being soldiers and remembered we were men. Tell them that the enemy is a lie, that behind every uniform is a person with dreams and fears and people who love them. And on Christmas Eve, or any night when the world feels too dark, too broken, too filled with hate, stand up and sing. It doesn't matter if you can't carry a tune. God loves an honest voice more than a pretty one. Sing and remember that peace is always possible, even when everything says it isn't. Sing and create a space where humanity can flourish, even if just for a moment. Sing, because that's what we do. We humans, we ridiculous, broken, beautiful creatures. We sing in the darkness and we hope. My time is almost up. I can feel it, the way you can feel a storm coming, that change in pressure that tells you something significant is about to happen. I'm not afraid. I've lived long enough, seen enough, carried these memories long enough. I'm ready to set them down and rest. But before I go, I want you to know this, that Christmas Eve in 1944 was the most important night of my life, more important than my wedding day, more important than the birth of my children, more important than any success or achievement or honor. Because that was the night I learned what we're capable of when we choose love over hate, connection over division, humanity over ideology. We were in hell. We were surrounded by death and cold and mud and horror. We had every reason to hate each other, to see each other as less than human, to kill without remorse or hesitation. And instead, we sang. That's what I want you to remember. That's what I need you to carry forward. Not the killing that came after, not the failures and compromises and betrayals, but that moment of transcendence when we stood together and created something beautiful in the midst of devastation. We sang. And for a few precious hours, we were not American or German, soldier or enemy, killer or killed. We were simply human, simply ourselves. Simply children of God, making music in the darkness, hoping desperately that someone was listening. I believe someone was. I believe that night mattered, that it still matters, that it will always matter. And I believe that every time someone tells this story, every time someone hears it and lets it change them, that Christmas Eve miracle happens again. So sing, please. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever darkness you're facing, sing. Stand up, lift your voice, and create beauty in the chaos. Be brave enough to see your enemies as human. Be foolish enough to believe that peace is possible. Be strong enough to choose connection over division. Sing and remember us. Remember Hans Becker and Red McCarthy and Klaus and Morrison and Hayes and all the others who learned in that frozen forest so long ago that the most powerful weapon we possess is not a gun or a bomb or an army, but our capacity to recognize the humanity in each other. Sing and keep the hope alive. That's all I have left to give you. That's my final message, my last testimony, my gift to a world that still hasn't learned the lessons we should have learned that night. Remember the night soldiers sang in the trenches. Remember their last song, not last because they died, but last because it was the final time they were allowed to be fully human before war claimed them again. Remember and sing. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or hope, please share it. Leave a comment below telling us what it meant to you. And if you believe, as I do, that stories like this need to be told and remembered, Subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing the human stories behind history's darkest moments. Because the only way we stop repeating our mistakes is by remembering them. Not just the facts and dates, but the feelings, the connections, the moments when we glimpsed what we could be, if we chose differently. This story is dedicated to every soldier who ever questioned what they were asked to do, whoever saw their enemy's humanity and struggled with it, whoever sang in the darkness and hoped someone heard. May we honor their memory by building the peace they died dreaming of. Thank you for listening. Now go sing.